It's a very complicated subject. I had hoped, as you know, that we could have gotten to the floor this week, but we're not quite there. But I think we've got a really good chance of getting there. It'll just take us a little bit longer.
Welcome to the Journal Editorial Report. I'm Paul Gigot. That was Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell earlier this week, following his announcement that the Senate would break for the July 4 recess without a vote on health care. Negotiations continue as the Republicans scramble to settle on a plan to repeal and replace Obamacare, with an impatient President Trump tweeting Friday, if Republican senators are unable to pass what they are working on now, they should immediately repeal and then replace at a later date. So what are the main obstacles to an agreement, and what are the consequences for the GOP if they fail to pass a bill? Let's ask Wall Street Journal columnist and deputy editor Dan Henninger, editorial board member Joe Rago, and columnist Bill McGurn. So, Joe, you're fated to cover this for us. What are the divisions inside the Republican Party that are preventing an agreement?
Well, there are two camps. One is the conservatives, people like Ted Cruz, Ron Johnson, who are kind of disappointed that it doesn't do enough on deregulation, but I think they're amenable to a deal. The real problem are the moderates. Block grant is not generous enough, and then there's all kinds of cats and dogs. They don't want to cut taxes for the rich.
Well, they don't want to repeal some of the Obamacare taxes that they campaigned to repeal.
Right.
Okay, so that's their problem.
Their problem is that when they said they wanted to repeal and replace Obamacare, they really didn't want to repeal all that much. So the question is, where is the Venn diagram between these two camps? We'll see if Mitch McConnell can find it.
And that's what McConnell has been trying to negotiate. The bigger problem, you're saying, though, politically, is the moderates who want to do much less on Medicaid reform. Aren't some of these people the same people who said, you know, we can't, oh my God, the deficit is too large, we have to do something about health care entitlements?
Right. Look, they've run on repeal and replace across 4 elections for nearly a decade. All these guys have voted in 2015 to repeal the bill, to repeal Obamacare.
Right.
Now that it might actually happen, they're getting cold feet.
They're saying, oh, don't make me take a tough vote.
Well, look, Paul, it's clear in retrospect to me that the most politically shrewd thing that Barack Obama and the architects of the Affordable Care Act did was expand Medicaid, because there are states like West Virginia, Ohio, Arizona that took them on. The states have always been desperate to fund their Medicaid.
Well, and here's the key, Dan. The Medicaid traditionally funded on a 50-50
exactly,
basis, more or less. This was a 90-10 deal.
A
90% of the cash.
And so you had
new people on.
You had Republican governors like John Kasich who took the money, and now they are literally addicted to this Medicaid money. And the problem is that if the Medicaid reforms go, states who didn't take the money, say like Florida, I think they're going to be obligated to buy into the Medicaid expansion, and then it's game over.
And the expansion of the Medicaid, it wasn't just more money at a 90-10 rate. It was also extended up to 138% of poverty.
Right.
So it became not just, Bill, for the disabled, not just for the truly needy and in poverty. It became essentially a slowly moving, gradually upward middle-class entitlement.
Absolutely. It's a huge, I mean, really, it's Obamacare, right? When they talk about people that now have health coverage, right, it's mostly Medicaid. Look, I think one of the issues, Medicaid is a great sort of crucible for this. And what's missing is the president on this. He's tweeted, I think he's done some good things, had some senators in. But what this really calls out for is like an Oval Office address where you address these myths. You know, as this is happening, the Democrats are putting out that the Republicans are cutting Medicaid rather than cutting the growth and so forth. And it would be very helpful for the president to give an address what the Republicans want to do, why they do, and explain it. That's supposed to be a strength.
All right. There's this idea about, Joe, that if Republicans can't get a deal, somehow they should reach out to Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader, and say, let's come reason together and have a bipartisan a bipartisan deal. Possible?
No. Well, in a limited sense, but the people calling for everybody to come together in a kumbaya circle never say what that deal would look like. There's no substance there whatsoever. And that's because there is not a bipartisan compromise. What happens if this fails is that Mitch McConnell is forced to go to Chuck Schumer and say, we've got to do something about the exchanges.
Because they're failing.
They're failing. You've got high and rising premiums and insurers leaving and tens of thousands of people in counties with zero insurers. So you will get a bailout of the exchanges that will be mainly Democrats with a few Republicans who are trying to prevent a crisis.
It'll be a ratification of Obamacare, essentially with more dough. It will have none of the reform that's in this current bill. So you'll get bipartisanship, but it would be as if Hillary Clinton got elected.
Schumer and say, we've got to do something about the exchanges.
Because they're failing.
They're failing. You've got high and rising premiums and insurers leaving and tens of thousands of people in counties with zero insurers. So you will get a bailout of the exchanges that will be mainly Democrats with a few Republicans who are trying to prevent a crisis.
It'll be a ratification of Obamacare, essentially with more dough. It will have none of the reform that's in this current bill. So you'll get bipartisanship, but it would be as if Hillary Clinton got elected.
Turn it to the status quo before Obamacare, which was not that good, but to improve it some way. That, to me, would be just an abdication.
And they would be responsible because they're running.
They'd be holding it in 2018. I mean, that's exactly what the Democrats want, to transfer ownership from the Democrats to the Republicans.
All right. Thank you all. When we the Constitution's separation of powers, as the Supreme Court allows most of his travel ban to go into effect. Parts of President Trump's controversial travel ban went into effect Thursday night after the Supreme Court ruled this week that nearly all of the president's directive could go forward. In a unanimous decision, the justices also agreed to review a series of lower court rulings blocking the implementation of the March executive order, which temporarily bars entry to the U.S. by nationals of 6 Muslim-majority nations. Oral arguments in the case are set for the fall, setting up a Supreme Court showdown over presidential power. Attorney David Rivkin served in the White House and Justice Department under Presidents Ronald Reagan and George Bush. Welcome, David. Good to see you.
Good to be with you.
So I know that you wrote for us, and you believe that this decision was a victory for presidential power as a legal matter and was the right decision. Never mind the policy, but just as a legal matter. Why?
Because the lower courts, both district courts and the 2 courts of appeal, the 4th and the 9th, have fundamentally deviated from the established Supreme Court case law that distinguishes between the extent of judicial engagement in domestic affairs, where the courts pay some deference to the executive, but basically scrutinize, particularly in situations where there's alleged violations of fundamental constitutional rights.
Right.
Executive actions, and in foreign affairs, where the deference is utmost, reflecting recognition that the 2 political branches possess the totality of foreign affairs power. Judiciary is neither the expertise nor the ability to really do very much there. So this basically pushes the pendulum back to where the law should be. Let me emphasize, this is way beyond this executive order, Paul. The framework that those lower courts have adopted would fundamentally destroy the ability of the presidency to carry out foreign policy.
Okay, I want to get into that, but let's. This is really interesting opinion because it was unanimous in order to reinstate the policy, at least until they can hear the merits in the autumn. Why do you how much do you read into, how much significance do you read into the fact that it was unanimous?
quite a bit, not to be too harsh, but what the courts of appeal have done is utterly aberrational. They have paid scant regard to the Supreme Court case law. In a way, it was a challenge not only to the presidency, because as you know, Paul, I believe that there is a, quote, resistance portion of the federal judiciary, which is bad enough, politicized judicial making, but it also was an implicit challenge to the Supreme Court. Remember, Article 3 is a hierarchical entity. The Supreme Court sets the tune. The lower courts are supposed to follow the music, so to speak.
Well, and when you say Article 3, you mean the article of the Constitution that applies to the courts. And you're saying that there are plenty of Supreme Court precedents that have said that on matters of national security, courts must defer to the political branches, in particular when those political branches, the Congress and the presidency, are united behind a policy. And you're saying that the lower branches here, the Fourth and the Ninth Circuit, the lower courts, really just ran roughshod over this, in part because they just don't like this president.
They don't like this president, and they've done it in a way that was most disingenuous. As I said, they paid no attention to the Supreme Court precedent. And it's not just a matter of deference. What's important here is this, and this transcends immigration. I mean, the same logic could be applied to the decision to use drones, to the decision to impose economic sanctions, frankly, the decision to use military force. Once the executive indicates clearly, and it's a legitimate bona fide reason why it's doing something, this is it. The judiciary takes it on board. There's no balancing type of analysis that you invariably see in domestic affairs.
Okay, but you think that the lower courts were so out of line that they should have reinstated, the Supreme Court should have reinstated the whole injunction, barred rather the whole injunction, should have allowed it to proceed, the travel ban. And yet, they did say that the travel ban, they did overrule the travel ban in certain narrow cases of individuals who have ties to American families in America, or institutions such as a college or university where you've been accepted for admission. And yet there was a dissent on that from 3 justices. What do you make of that disagreement?
I frankly think, Paul, it's a slight disagreement. I think the Chief Justice has accepted this fairly narrow category of people who will come in. And again, this is not about policy equity, Paul. This is about the Constitution at the highest level.
Right.
Getting 9 justices on board is perfectly fine as far as the exception. Supreme Court exercised its own equitable discretion. What's important to underscore for the viewers, if the lower courts were right, nobody could be stopped under this executive order. So the very fact that vast majority of the people are going to be stopped now for its duration underscores how thoroughly they've taken this off the table. The legal theories, again, what troubles me the most are not the policy consequences, frankly, of stopping this ban, but the legal consequences of eviscerating established case law. It says, again, in foreign affairs, political branches reign supreme.
Yeah, you don't want judges meddling, making second-guessing decisions on the executive. They don't have either the expertise or the knowledge to do so. But I want to ask you about what to expect in the fall when the justices address this on the merits. You could go for a 9-0 decision. We know the Chief Justice likes those kinds of decisions. But would he have to make too many concessions to get the liberals on board? And would you prefer a 5-4 split that makes a really thunderous ruling on behalf of presidential power?
The latter, Paul, because again, the policy stakes here, in my opinion, are quite minor. No, I think speaking with a clear voice, some chastisement in a measured fashion, and rearticulation of the proper paradigm for judicial engagement in this area is absolutely essential. This was a reasonable compromise to get 9 on board for the stay. When we get to the merits, with our argument coming, I think, the first week of October, look, I hope we're going to get 9 behind a perfect decision, but probably not. So 6-3, 5-4 would be wonderful, and this would not be the time to pull punches. And by the way, as you point out in your editorial, I have no doubt that the left is going to put serious pressure on the Chief Justice, the way they've done with Obamacare, for example. So it's very important to keep up the countervailing pressure as well.
All right. Thank you, David Rifkin. When we come back, the Supreme Court wraps up its term with a big victory for religious liberty. We'll take a closer look at this week's ruling and what it says about the court's newest justice. The Supreme Court wrapped up its term this week with a big win for religious liberty. In a closely watched case, the justices ruled 7-2 that Missouri acted improperly when it denied public funds to a Lutheran church seeking assistance from a state program providing grants for playground improvements. We're back with Dan Henninger, Wall Street Journal columnist Bill McGurn, and editorial page features editor James Taranto also join us. Bill, so how big a victory was this for religious freedom?
Oh, I think it's a big victory. I think I said before, in medieval times they debated angels on pinheads. Today we debate whether a playground that's Lutheran can qualify for funds. I will say I don't think these are the biggest religious liberty cases because it's about funding, or the previous case at the Supreme Court that was 9-0 about running their own business. Where it's really going to clash are the cases that they're going to take, like the cake baker case from Colorado.
And whether or not they can exercise conscience in relation to gay marriage.
Lesbian and gay rights. Right. And that's where the real nasty clashes are going to occur.
But James, really interesting dynamics here. 7-2. Elena Kagan joined the majority.
Right, and Stephen Breyer.
Sonia Sotomayor's dissent was really tough. And so there's some division there even among the liberals on this.
Yes, that's true. And also there was a footnote in the case, which was the only part of the opinion that Justices Thomas and Gorsuch didn't join, which said we're only deciding the limited circumstances of this case. So the majority is leaving some wiggle room for future cases.
So what do you make of this division between the liberals?
Well, I think that this is a case in which it's a question of how absolute do you want to be about the separation of church and state. The argument here was the state had a policy of giving grants to organizations, and it was discriminating against religion as opposed to supporting religion for the sake of religion.
And that's where some liberals might say, okay, that's just not right.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
But interestingly, the next day, the Supreme Court then sent orders back to the Supreme Courts of Colorado and New Mexico, which had ruled against public funding being used for religious purposes, religious school programs. Schools.
Private school vouchers.
And the Supreme Court told those two courts, reconsider your opinion. That's a big deal because there are these so-called Blaine amendments all over the country that forbid using public money for religious schools.
And by the way, when the court said about 15 years ago that states could, not must, but could extend voucher programs to parochial schools, that was a 5-4 decision.
That was a 5-4 decision. Now, these Blaine amendments, Bill,
right,
go back to the 1880s, I think,
right,
and they were aimed at a period where the Protestant majorities in this country were trying to say no money for all these upstart Italian and Irish immigrant schools. We don't want Catholic schools.
The way they did it was the public schools were Protestant schools.
Right.
Sectarian meant Catholic. And we're stuck with this. I would say, look, this is where Donald Trump gets credit for Neil Gorsuch. If you read his opinions, they're very subtle, and he also rejects kind of these facile distinctions. He talked about is someone who says grace before a meal, is that a religious meal or religious man, and so forth. And I think this is far more important than, for example, the president's executive order on religious liberty, which I don't think amounts to as much.
Yeah, and let's talk, fellows, about Gorsuch, because we got our first glimpse of him as a justice this week, or this term, and I don't think you can reach conclusions about any justice in a few weeks, maybe even in a couple of years. It takes a while to see how they do. But what do you think about his debut?
Well, the thing that strikes me most about it is he's a wonderful writer, and my job is finding good writing. I think he's only written 3 opinions so far, and most of them have been about boring subjects like the regulation of debt collection agencies. But you read them, and they're marvelously clear and just a pleasure to read. But the clarity is also important. I think that carries over to the way he thinks about the law.
Yeah, and I would just elaborate on that, Dan. The clarity shows, to me anyway, a justice who's very confident in what he thinks about the law. This is somebody who feels very comfortable with the text of statutes, knows that that's how he interprets statutes, goes to the text, and then and so it's not, I'm going to make it up as I go. He knows what he's doing in looking at these cases, and you can almost sense, that he's going to be a force intellectually on the court.
Well, it sounds like you're describing Justice Scalia without the doubts. He did align himself several times.
Without the Scalia self-doubt?
The Scalia self-doubts.
That's an ironic point, just for the record.
Well, for instance, he aligned himself with Justice Thomas, where the court declined to hear a case on whether people could carry guns outside their home for their personal use. Justice Thomas and Justice Gorsuch wanted to take that case, and that is the kind of area in which Scalia might have had a little bit of doubt. He aligned himself with Justice Thomas on what Bill was talking about, a more forceful, vigorous defense of the free expression of religion. So I think he is going to be solidly there with Justice Thomas and probably Justice Alito on virtually everything.
Now, this wasn't a big term in terms of because it was 4-4 for much of it, but there was some big case on free speech, James.
Yes, this was the case involving the Slants, which is an Asian American rock band. They'd been denied a trademark on the grounds that it was disparaging, and they challenged this, and the Supreme Court struck down the Patent and Trademark Office's disparagement clause, which means the Washington Redskins will continue to be around. But what was really important about this case was the cultural statement the court made. Two opinions, one by Justice Alito, one by Justice Kennedy, both affirmed in very strong terms that there is no such thing as a separate category of hate speech that is not protected by the First Amendment, a common misunderstanding these days.
All right, fascinating. Gentlemen, still ahead, the White House issued a rare public warning to the Syrian government this week amid signs that they're planning another chemical attack. So did the warning save lives? And is there a long-term serious strategy in the works? The White House warned this week that Syrian forces would, quote, pay a heavy price amid signs that the Assad government may be planning another chemical attack on its people. The Pentagon on Tuesday said it detected active preparations for chemical weapons use at Sherrod Airfield, the site of April's U.S. cruise missile strike. But UN Ambassador Nikki Haley told Congress Wednesday that the administration's warning may have averted the attack and saved innocent lives.
I think that by the president calling out Assad, I think by us continuing to remind Iran and Russia that while they choose to back Assad, that this was something we were not going to put up with. So I would like to think that the president saved many innocent men, women, and children.
Cliff May is the president of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He joins me now from Washington. Welcome back, Cliff. Good to see you. So do you really think that the Assad regime would tempt fate again and try another chemical attack after what happened to them the first time?
I certainly think the warning has given them pause, and it may be that they're not going to do that again, that they recognize that if they cross that red line, there is a president now who will take action and make them feel some pain. So I certainly hope that's true for the sake of saving innocent lives. I also think it's important that the U.S. show again, as it has in this instance, that it is a power to be reckoned with. And the other ways that has been done in recent days, shooting down a Syrian plane and shooting down some Iranian-made drones. Those are important signals, among other things.
So what you're seeing here is the resurrection, the revival of the U.S. deterrent effect against rogue behavior. And that was, of course, missing for many, many years under the previous administration. Is that how you see it?
Absolutely, I do. If the deterrent is credible, it means you probably don't have to take action. Having used missiles once against Assad, it may be that we don't have to do it another time in this instance. Although there's plenty more we have to do, and that has to be done if this part of the world, if the fires in this part of the world are going to subside, much less be put out.
Well, I want to talk about that, but let's talk about. You mentioned the drone and the airplane shoot down. Now, when that happened, the U.S. was taking down aircraft that looked to be threatening American forces allied with America on the ground in fighting Islamic State. Russia and Iran reacted and said, "Don't do it again. We're going to challenge your aircraft." And yet we haven't seen that at all since then. Was that just a false threat?
Well, I think it was a bit of a game of chicken, and I think the Russians and others have to decide whether they think they can make the current U.S. administration back down. They, as you inferred or implied, I don't think they had any fear whatsoever of the Obama administration. They knew that Obama would always back down, would always stay away from action. Now they have to say, do we want to escalate? Now there is a possibility of escalation. They have to decide if they go out at high noon and draw their gun, are they going to be first honest and more accurate.
All right, so we know, we've heard this week, Mosul in Iraq is about to be liberated from Islamic State. Raqqa in Syria may not be far behind. Islamic State is going on the road to defeat, at least in its major enclaves. So what happens then? And is there a strategy that you see here that the United States has?
Yeah, this is a key question. Look, I think the defeat of the most ambitious and adventuristic jihadist expression, which is the reestablishment of a caliphate in the 21st century, if we defeat that, that's a good day. Let's celebrate that, but let's be careful, because we have a big day after problem. What do we do after? And we do not want to be the expeditionary force for Iran and for Russia and for Assad and others in Syria, and that could be the case. As far as a policy or a strategy,
yeah, that's what I want to hear. What's the U.S. strategy?
I do not think if we have a strategy, it has not been clearly articulated yet. And it's not going to be easy to come up with, because whatever strategy we have is going to have some serious downsides. There are no good strategies, there are bad strategies and worse, and it's going to take a bit of thought and consideration to figure out which is which. So I do think the day after problem is enormous. I think there are things that there are aspects of a strategy, such as safe zones, or I'd call them self-protection zones. Right. There are enclaves that have been in place really since 2012 that we can fortify, but we do not want to do it what essentially we did in Iraq, which is we take the country away from a terrible ruler such as Saddam Hussein and end up having that redound to the benefit of Iran, which is trying to establish a new empire, a Shia crescent in the Middle East.
That's the point I wanted to ask you about, because I think I know, after ISIS is defeated, what Iran and Syria and Russia want. Okay, Assad wants to run all of Syria again. Iran wants a Shiite arc of power from Tehran all the way to the Mediterranean, and the Russians want an ally that they can say, we help survive, and you give us a couple of military bases and a port. But it isn't clear that any of that is in the United States' interest. And how do we stop that from happening? Because those forces on the ground are going to keep pressing that, and it seems to me that we're going to have to respond with some kind of military force, either enforcing the enclaves for the Kurds or for the Sunnis, or maybe air power.
I think that's exactly right, and that's why it is so difficult, because we could win the battle today and lose the war tomorrow, and that's why we do need a policy and a strategy, and I think at least some of its components are going to be to set up those enclaves, to have the Sunnis not feel threatened by the Shia, by the Iranians, because if they do, they will look for any champion, including a champion like ISIS. We haven't mentioned Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is very strong. Right. It hasn't gotten media attention, hasn't gotten military attention, but there are various Al-Qaeda affiliates that are also looking to take advantage of the situation. Assad, and he has supported most of his effective fighting forces, are Iranian proxies. He's trying to now move east towards the Iraqi border. We have all these problems. I have to think that that Secretary Mattis and National Security Advisor McMaster need to be thinking about this very hard and saying, how do we at least frustrate the ambitions of Iran and of Russia and of Assad, and not allow this to become part of a new Persian Empire.
All right, Cliff May, thanks for being here. Still ahead, from independence to dominance, a look at President Trump's new energy strategy next.
We're here today to usher in a new American energy policy, one that unlocks millions and millions of jobs and trillions of dollars in wealth. My administration will seek not only the American energy independence that we've been looking for so long, but American energy dominance.
From independence to dominance, that was President Trump Thursday, unveiling his administration's new energy policy and vowing to reduce regulations and boost U.S. production of oil, natural gas, and coal to export around the world. It's a move the White House says will create American jobs and help American allies. We're back with Dan Henninger, Joe Rago, and Bill McGurn. So it was supposed to be Energy Week, Dan. President's tweets kind of got in the way again of that. So it was instead of an energy week, maybe energy hours or energy day. But nonetheless, a lot going on behind the scenes in policy. What's happening?
Yes, that's right, Paul. That speech was given around 3:30. About the hour, the entire media was, obsessing over the Mika Brzezinski tweet. But nonetheless, the president announced some very serious things. He's going to allow drilling for oil in the Arctic and in the Atlantic. He's going to accelerate the creation of pipelines. He's going to have a rethink of nuclear policy, more permitting for new coal mines. He is going all out, full speed ahead on energy policy, which arguably at this point, Paul, is the strongest card Donald Trump has played since he's become president.
What do you mean the strongest card? Do you mean economically or strategically or both?
Economically and strategically. Economically, because the United States is now beginning to export up to 1 million barrels of oil a day, unprecedented because of the revolution in fracking. Strategically, because Energy Secretary Rick Perry was talking about energy dominance. And what he means by that is that the United States now exporting all of this energy out there. We're going to establish new relationships with trading partners that we haven't had before, probably reducing the dominance of Russia, because formerly all of the national gas would go through pipelines. Now we'll be able to ship it directly to Europe and OPEC and Saudi Arabia. So it's a big deal.
It is a big deal, Joe. And let's just kind of break that down a little bit. It's really got two big components. Let's leave coal aside. We've got this liquefied natural gas, building these terminals. And that gas is being produced through the fracking revolution, this new way of tapping into horizontal drilling, tapping into natural gas reservoirs underneath the ground, and also oil exports. The Congress basically forced President Obama to lift the oil export ban, and that's paying big dividends.
It is. Crude oil exports have doubled over the last 6 years. It's really a sea change, and it's an incremental policy win of the kind that pays dividends over time. A lot of conservatives said at the time, well, the export ban wasn't sufficient to justify a deal, but we're really seeing the economic results of that right now.
That's helped American producers find new markets, Bill, which is crucial. Because with oil prices falling in half, a lot of them might have gone out of business, drillers, if we didn't have this new export market. And now we're also being able to displace some of the imports in oil that we otherwise would have had to buy.
Right. We're allowing markets to develop. Look, one of the problems we've had over the years is that the countries that had oil that we were dependent on were generally not great actors. Russia, Venezuela, the Arab countries, and we were very vulnerable. That's why the pitch to American energy independence was so strong for every president. I'm a little skeptical of that because you want a global market.
Yeah, you want a global market.
But now we have, as we say, we have new jobs everywhere because of this, and especially with Mr. Putin in Europe, it gives the Europeans some reassurance that he's not going to use his energy to bully them into something. So it's a win all around for this, and a lot of the reason it didn't develop was because of regulations, and that's really where he's going at it.
That's right, and that's really the difference, huge difference between the Obama administration and Trump. The Obama administration just hostile to fossil fuels generally. Even Obama couldn't stop the fracking revolution; it was so strong. But he could deter it, slow it down, make it harder. And what Trump is doing is unleashing it.
Yeah, and it relates as well, as Bill is suggesting, to our foreign policy. We've moved away from this kind of pointless argument about energy independence. There's never going to be any such a thing with global energy markets. Trump has recognized that energy markets are global, and he is using our skills in energy to establish relationships both economically and strategically with allies out there in Europe. And so this has moved the energy conversation in an entirely more productive direction.
Thank you all. When we come back, False Black Power, a provocative new book by the Wall Street Journal's own Jason Riley, who argues that the political strategy of civil rights leaders has left many blacks behind. Jason joins us next. False Black Power. That's the title of Wall Street Journal columnist and Manhattan Institute senior fellow Jason Riley's new book out this week. Jason joins us now. Here we go. It's a sprightly read, Jason, provocative. What do you mean by false black power?
Well, the book is really a critique of a civil rights strategy that's been in place since really the 1960s, and that is to focus on gaining political power for blacks, electing more black officials in the hopes that that will bring along socioeconomic advancement. And I thought Obama's presidency was sort of the culmination of this strategy.
In the White House.
So let's look back and see how that strategy has fared.
And what do you think? Where has it failed?
Well, it's failed for a number of reasons, but we should never have thought it would succeed based on how other groups have risen from poverty to prosperity.
Well, wait a minute.
They haven't focused.
But the Irish, when the Irish, they put a premium when they came here on political power, Boston and New York, and you would think that that has had some success.
Well, they're an example of a group that has followed a similar path to what blacks are following. It turns out that the Irish were the slowest to grow economically of all the immigrant groups from Europe.
In contrast to the Germans.
In contrast to the Germans, the Italians, the Asians, and so forth, all of whom did not place their focus on attaining political clout first. They focused on building their human capital, cultural development, skills and attitudes, and so forth. And politics came later.
So politics is not this promised land. It can help, but so where should the focus be?
Well, I think the focus should be on what it was before the civil rights establishment adopted this strategy. And so a lot of people don't like comparisons between blacks and immigrant groups because of the history of slavery and so forth.
Of course.
So I say compare blacks today to blacks in the first half of the 20th century. And if you look back at that period, when the focus was not on politics, when blacks had virtually no political clout, you saw gaps, racial gaps closing in income and educational attainment and lifting ourselves out of poverty and so forth. After the 60s, after the switch in this, the shift in this strategy to gaining political clout, a lot of those trends stalled, slowed, even retrogressed. And I think we need to get back to building that human capital, which is what blacks were more focused on before the attention turned to pursuing politics.
But the focus, you're not saying that Jim Crow did not have to be destroyed, and that was a focus on political power.
It was.
Okay, and that had to happen.
What I'm saying is that political power is neither necessary nor sufficient for a group to rise. And by the way, this strategy has worked on its own terms. The number of black elected officials in this country grew from something like 1,500 or less than 1,500 in 1970 to more than 10,000 by 2010, including a black president. But you look at how the black poor have fared in the wake of all this gaining of political power, and it's not well. And we should have learned this lesson from what was happening in cities where blacks had been run. Your Detroits, your Clevelands, your Philadelphia. You look at Coleman Young's Detroit, Marion Barry's Washington, D.C. The black poor did not do well during those periods.
So was the break from a policy and intellectual point of view in the 60s? You had the great success of the Civil Rights Movement. You had the smashing of Jim Crow. You had the Voting Rights Act. You had the Civil Rights Act, and the empowerment of millions, tens of millions of black Americans because of that. But then the focus shifted away from things where it should have shifted. Should the focus then have become economic empowerment, economic growth, things like education opportunity?
Yes, and that's what's happening before, and that was working and closing these racial gaps. When that strategy was abandoned, or when the emphasis shifted, that is when, again, we talk a lot about the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, Paul. We don't talk a lot about the legacy of the welfare state.
That's what I want to
great society.
That's where the focus shifted, and suddenly the political power, they all said, oh, we're going to provide these benefits to you. And you're saying that that's been destructive?
It's been extremely destructive, and you can look at case studies in places like Atlanta, where in the 70s and 80s, black mayors like Maynard Jackson and Andrew Young came in, and they gave black city contractors special permissions and catered to affirmative action policies and set-asides for minority contractors and so forth. The black poor lost ground in this period. In this age of more black political empowerment, the black poor have lost ground economically, both in absolute terms and relative to the white poor. So the strategy is not working. We ought to revisit it.
All right, Jason Riley, thanks for being here. We have to take one more break. When we come back, hits and misses of the week.